And now we're going to bring in Dr. Williams to get into the minutia of all this, and hopefully he can answer the question on everybody's mind: are the vaccines in fact safe?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us and Jose for putting the group together. Throughout my career, I have had to follow Brent Myers speaking. So today is another example of that, but hopefully we'll manage to make it through here. I did want to get into the weeds. I know all of you are terribly surprised that to go through the weeds with everybody on some of the detail, but we are 100% being super transparent about this, and you'll see throughout my talk that we've got links to all of these documents that we're discussing as well, if anybody wants to read them on their own, or if anyone does read them on their own and has further questions that we didn't cover here. Please do shoot one of us a text or give us a call, or find us in the ER or wherever, and we'll walk you through it as best we know. So this slide, and Don, you can go to the next slide, basically is just a title placeholder for the information that was presented to the FDA to grant emergency use authorization for the Pfizer vaccine. And as you guys know, that happened this past week on December 10th. So I wanted to talk just for a minute about what is emergency use authorization, and again, kind of reassure everybody that just like we've been arguing about vaccines since the beginning of our country, emergency use authorization has been around for a long time as well, and this isn't something that's new and invented, solely for this situation or anything like that. So emergency use authorization, obviously EUA for short, is authority granted to the FDA to make available a drug. It could be a device, it could be a test, any sort of biologic product that may be effective to prevent, diagnose, or treat serious or life-threatening illness or condition. So first established in 1938 and since reauthorized multiple times, most recently in the setting of a lot of the bioterrorism legislation that happened earlier in the 2000s. And basically the sort of rate limiting step, or the first thing that has to happen for an EUA to be granted for any reason, is that somebody in charge of one of our cabinets, either DHS Defense or DHHS, must declare that there is an emergency, right? In this case, a public health emergency that DHHS has declared, and then you can sort of move forward with the EUA process. And as Brent mentioned before, it's important to realize that EUA is not full FDA approval. The standard for EUA is that a drug device test may be effective and is not as high of a standard, frankly, as full approval. Now, that said, there is a very rigorous risk-benefit analysis that EUA uses that is based on, quote, the totality of scientific evidence available, right? So people aren't picking and choosing. This isn't, something where people are looking at sort of only the good results, if you will. But drug manufacturers and those that would review the data on these drugs, vaccines in this case, must use the totality of the scientific evidence available. The real difference between EUA and full FDA approval is that full FDA approval requires, quote, substantial evidence. And without going too far into the weeds about what that is, it basically just means more studies, right? So more studies and not necessarily more time. As Brent mentioned, we all should be very excited about Operation Warp Speed and the fast laser focus that people put on this process, right? There weren't relaxed timelines. There wasn't, hey, let's wait another year for another study on whatever drug that might be important but isn't as important as this vaccine. It was, we're going to do this now, and this is going to be a focus for our agency, and this is going to be a focus for drug makers, and we're going to get it done quickly. And then lastly, I just wanted to say EUA is in place right now for a lot of things that would apply in our world, right? So Ebola antigen test is available under EUA. There is a certain type of freeze-dried plasma and the process they use to freeze-dry that plasma that our military uses right now. It was developed in Europe, and for it to be able to be used in the U.S. for our military without full authorization, they have an EUA. And then actually atropine auto-injectors, similar to the ones that we carry, right, for nerve agent use, are available under EUA, a specific type of auto-injector, a specific dose and formulation. So there's a lot out there that we use today, and EUA shouldn't be something that's worrisome or scary. So what's the history on EUA for this process? February 4th, 2020, the HHS secretary declared that emergency that we talked about that's necessary. Again, laser focus on the vaccine versus usual timelines. And this was how we were able to get this done quickly. That said, I want to make it really crystal to everybody that there were no corners cut in terms of how these vaccines were developed compared to any other drug. So again, without going into weeks worth of details, drugs are required to have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials before they are even considered for either FDA approval or EUA. All 3 phases of trials were completed for these vaccines. Moderna and Pfizer happened to sort of win the race as far as getting them done and getting their data analyzed. But I want to reassure everyone that phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials were completed for these vaccines. In fact, we'll actually talk about the phase 1 trial for Moderna here in a few slides. So what happened next was, again, last week, the FDA has an independent vaccine advisory committee that basically votes to recommend whether the FDA should approve for EUA a vaccine or a drug. That happened on the 10th, and the FDA, obviously, these slides I made on Friday, and obviously a lot's happened even since Friday. The FDA over the weekend accepted that recommendation, and then the CDC also basically said, yes, we are willing to accept the FDA's recommendation, and these vaccines that are getting shipped around the country at this point, we think that it's a good idea that the American public should receive those shots. Is the bottom line on that? And Don, you can go to the next slide.
Before we go, I think it's important to point out that the Vaccine Advisory Committee covers all vaccine. It is not just specific to the COVID-19 vaccine. This isn't something that was just created. This committee just wasn't created for COVID-19. That committee's been around and makes their recommendation for all vaccines.
Yeah, very good point. Excellent. Absolutely. So what basically the drug manufacturers and the FDA does at its advisory committee meeting, and obviously associated analysis, is they try to figure out 2 things. Is the vaccine safe? And is it efficacious, right? Does it work in study conditions, as Brent pointed out earlier? And so we want to talk about the safety and efficacy profile of specifically the Pfizer vaccine, because that's the one we know the most about at this point, but a little bit also about the Moderna vaccine in terms of what we know so far. Safety simply means how many unexpected adverse events versus expected adverse events happen with a given vaccine, right? So when you study a population of 30,000 people or 40,000 people over a period of time, whether that's a short period of time or a long period of time, unfortunately, bad stuff happens to those 30,000 people, right? Some of them going to die. Some of them going to have a heart attack and die in the middle of their drug trial, right? Other people are going to get hit by a car, right? There is, believe it or not, and I'm getting a little far in the weeds here, there is a description of a facial fracture adverse event due to an assault to a vaccine trial participant in the Pfizer minutia. And they had to do an analysis of whether or not this guy got assaulted as a result of receiving either placebo or true vaccine in the Pfizer trial. So the point is, bad stuff happens to people whether you're in the control group of placebo or whether you're getting the vaccine. And the job of the scientist is to figure out whether or not those adverse events are likely related to the vaccine or not, and or if they can't tell, do they occur in a number that is more substantial in one group than another, right? That's how you sort of do that analysis. Efficacy, not to repeat too much of what Brent said, basically just means the performance of the vaccine. Did it work as intended? And a lot of this data, or really the detail of this data that we know about, was that first title slide that Don showed for my part, which is the briefing document, the 53-page briefing document that all of us have read in every word for that Pfizer BioNTech EUA meeting that happened on the 10th. Don, you can go to the next slide. So this information we're about to go through comes from that briefing document. So let's talk first about safety, right? So we can't move to efficacy if the vaccine's not safe. We have safety data from about 38,000 participants with a median of 2 months of follow-up for this vaccine. Adverse events, just based simply on technology, that could possibly be linked to receiving that vaccination shot, generally start well within 6 weeks, usually within a few days, potentially, of receiving the vaccine. So FDA feels like, a 2 months follow-up, while relatively short, is an appropriate follow-up time to report these safety data. And again, we're talking about serious adverse events for participants. We look at every case of appendicitis. The scientists look at every case of MI, every case of stroke, every case of death. There were some in both groups. Those obviously were very small and unrelated to the vaccine. What we call solicited adverse events are what people are probably more familiar with as side effects, right? So these are expected things, right? So I know I joke around with some of you guys every year when I get my flu shot. I am one of the unlucky fraction of people that have a little bit of an immune response that I'm frankly proud of, right? I take my Motrin and I get my flu shot and I ache for a day or two and, whine about it. And these guys make fun of me. But the point is that is evidence of your immune system working, right? Building antibodies to whatever medicine is that you just received, right? And so these are solicited adverse events. We knew going into this that if you inject, a vaccine into someone, some fraction of those people are going to get injection site pain, are going to get fatigue, are going to get headache, chills, muscle joint pain. And so you want to know, sort of the fraction of the time that occurs, one group compared to the other. And then also, are there anything that's unexpected? Really, the only thing that was kind of interesting about the Pfizer vaccine was that there were 64 cases of swollen lymph nodes, right? So people got a little bit of lymphadenopathy, just like you might get with a sore throat, maybe a little axillary lymphadenopathy like you might get with a viral syndrome. That was really the only thing that they sort of said, typically we don't see a ton of that with vaccines, but that was obviously minor and self-limited. So here's the punchline. This is the primary outcome for the phase 3 trial that Pfizer presented to the FDA. So what you see there is 2 red circles. And at the very top of the table, column 1, you have about 18,000 participants. Column 2, you have about 18,000 participants. And that first group is the vaccine group in the first column, and the second group is the placebo group. And the punchline is that in the vaccine group of the patients who actually received COVID vaccine, only 8 patients got COVID. On the flip side, 162 patients who were in the placebo group got COVID. So that's how you hear in the media about this 95% efficacy, right? You do the math, and that turns out to be a 95% efficacious vaccine. Important to note that they also looked as a secondary outcome severity of cases of COVID. One case was severe in the patients who were vaccinated, and 9 cases were severe in the patients who received placebo. Don, you can go to the next slide. And I'm going to ask to see if Brent or Jose or Don has any comment on this slide after I go through it. It's a little bit detailed, so I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. But this, to me, is striking and a good graphical representation of the efficacy of this vaccine. So what you're seeing is a survival curve. Is sort of the name of the graph, but it's not about life or death in this case. But what you see across the x-axis, across the bottom, is basically time, right? Time counted in days. And then what you see on the y-axis, which is represented by each one of those little squares and circles, is a case of COVID. And the cases sort of count. They stack up on top of each other over time. And so you see over a period of time who got COVID based on those little stacked squares and circles, right? So the blue line with the blue circles is people who got true, real deal Pfizer vaccine, and the red line and the red squares are the people who were in the placebo group. So you see over this median of, approaching 120 days, that the blue line and the red line track together, and this is days after dose 1, days after day 0, which is vaccination dose 1. The blue line and the red line track together until right about day 10, maybe day 14, and then the lines start to diverge. This makes complete sense based on the fact that if you get vaccinated on day 1, it's going to take your body a few days to build up immunity, right? You still got to wear your mask right after you're vaccinated for sure. and start building those antibodies. And then right around day 14, when your body's got plenty of antibodies, those lines dramatically diverge, and people in the placebo group still accumulate cases of COVID over time, whereas people in the placebo group do not accumulate those cases over time, right? And as Brent mentioned before, there's plenty of data to suggest that there's no waning protection, at least over the follow-up time that we know about so far. Guys, any other comment or thought on those?
Yeah, Jeff, I was going to say, this is to me one of the most important slides, and it's one of the importance. If anybody wants to take a look at the FDA handout that was presented to the committee, that is actually public, it's like a 50-some page document. This is one of the most important content of that handout that was evaluated for all data. It summarizes the striking impact and efficacy of this vaccine, and how both groups are marching together. You can see a clear split off at that day, sort of 7-10 right there. So I think that to me is actually very striking. I think it's something that it's a visualization of how valuable this vaccine is. It's pretty impressive. And while we've been recording this video, Jeff, I just posted in the chat that the first vaccine was given in the U.S. Already this morning. So we're going to turn the corner hopefully soon, and we're making progress.
And Jeff, just one other thing to throw in there, because I know that we have a great group that is very into the weeds and counts data, and we're glad that they do. If you start counting those blue circles, there's going to be more blue circles than there were on the previous slide. And the reason is, remember, the trial was that you started counting cases at the 21st day, right? So there are some cases even after the split that are not counted in the trial because they are advertising that the vaccine is not efficacious until, if I've counted right, I think it's day 28 on this graph is where they actually cut the data. In other words, they were not advertising that it was going to work before that period of time. So even though you see the split occurred earlier than they thought it was going to, honestly. But if you start counting those blue circles, there's more blue circles here than there were on the previous slide, and that's why. The other thing to keep in mind is Moderna counts 7 days even farther. So when you see the Moderna results, they waited to what would be day 35 on this graph to count their results. So I know that people want to be very precise about their data and make sure that all is transparent. And I figured somebody would count those up and figure out the numbers weren't right, and that's why. Yeah,
absolutely. Totally related to how they're defining their endpoint, their primary endpoint. And again, you can slice and dice this a lot of different ways. Don, thanks. And you can go to the next slide. So just real briefly, I want to go through a little bit about what we know about Moderna. So this week, 1 week after the Pfizer meeting, is going to be a very similar meeting for the FDA for the Moderna vaccine. We don't have as much data right now available to us or to anyone on the Moderna vaccine for that reason, right? That FDA meeting hasn't happened yet. We do know phase 1 data from Moderna, as that was published in the New England Journal. That is a free access article. Anybody can get that and read it if you want to. And what we do know about phase 3 information on the Moderna vaccine was based on a news release. And so we all saw that, we all reacted to that. And basically they're presenting similar information to what we know about Pfizer, which is of these thousands and thousands of people that were studied, how many cases of COVID occurred in the group that got vaccinated versus how many occurred in the group that got placebo. It's a similar technology as the Pfizer vaccine, as Brent had already mentioned, and likely there is a similar efficacy and safety profile, but we won't know yet until we take a look at those data later this week. Don, you can go to the next slide. So in the Moderna trial, one thing that was a little bit interesting was that the phase 1 trial actually showed only half those participants started to develop antibodies after the first shot. Both of these vaccines require a 2-shot series, as Brent pointed out on the prior slide. That's how they measured their overall efficacy for the trial. This just tells us potentially the importance of both doses, regardless of which vaccine you get, right? So in the Moderna data, it may be the case that there's a little bit less immunity conferred after the first dose than compared to Pfizer, but it would be speculation to say so far. The point being, take both doses if that's what's recommended. And again, the phase 3 information on Moderna based on that press release were that 185 patients in the placebo group got COVID versus 11 patients in the vaccine group. And one thing that was notable, again, there's confidence intervals around this, obviously, but zero severe cases in the vaccine group for Moderna, which is pretty impressive. And again, based on the press release, the side effect profile is likely similar to Pfizer, and I believe that's what we're talking about next. Yep, so potential side effects. So these side effects are all listed in a table. I know that's probably hard to see. Maybe you can get in close to your computer screen there, but these are all in a table on the FDA briefing document. And, it's just hard to kind of ballpark. I heard one person that I trust say, for most people, it's probably going to be a little worse than the flu vaccine, but not as bad as the shingles vaccine. I haven't had the shingles vaccine. I don't know. But bottom line is you're probably going to get a little bit of an immune response, probably more likely after the second dose of either vaccine. And if you're somebody who gets one already when you get the flu, take a little Motrin, take a little Tylenol, whatever you want to do. But this is something that you should basically expect. I want to point out that a lot of the press and media about this has sort of reported the frequency of certain complaints after the vaccine in the vaccine group. I think it's important to note that people in the placebo group also report side effects, which has always been interesting to me, right? But people are walking through life with a headache and, fatigue and fever, occasionally, and that's fine. It ain't related to the vaccine, and it's probably more reasonable to compare sort of the difference between the two groups than, sort of the singular rate of symptoms in the group that got the vaccine. So, for example, shortly after getting the vaccine, 47 people in the vaccine group, after getting their injection, 47% of people in the vaccine group versus 33% of people in the placebo group reported that they were tired. Well, guess what, friends? It's 2020. We're all tired, right? So, I'm not 100% sure we need to worry about 47% of the people in the vaccine group reporting fatigue. Headaches, similarly, fever, and sort of on down. Obviously, things like fever, they're going to be a bigger difference between the vaccine group than the placebo group. But nonetheless, it's important to take a look, I think, at both columns. And I just want to reiterate, I think this is super important. I know we already said it. But, you cannot get COVID from this vaccine. You can't get whatever the disease in question is from any of the vaccines. But specifically for the mRNA vaccine, there is nothing close to COVID anywhere in your body, right? So what this little liposomes are doing, which is the delivery vehicle for the mRNA, is injecting blueprints, right? It is putting a set of building plans into your cells. The construction mechanisms of the cell are nowhere close to the nucleus, nowhere close to your own DNA, and those little builders in your own cells take a look at those plans and say, okay, we're supposed to build this protein. And they build a protein that looks like the spike protein for COVID, which is how you get antibodies to it, but it is not anywhere close to your DNA or your body's genetic material. So, people want to talk about Pfizer versus Moderna. Should I get one? Should I get the other? Does it really matter? I will tell you that I will personally roll up my sleeve for whichever one is offered to me first. It may be the Pfizer vaccine. Wake Med is probably my first avenue in for the vaccine, if not Wake County Public Health. And if it happens to be the Pfizer vaccine and I'm offered that, this week or next week, sign me up. If I'm allocated to a little bit of a later group and it's a week or two from now and Moderna happens to be available, sign me up, right? There are really not a ton of differences based on, number one, the very similar technology. There are a couple of practical considerations that may be worth talking about. Cold storage. The Moderna vaccine has to be kept slightly less cold than the Pfizer vaccine. That probably has to do with the stabilization of the delivery vehicle more than anything else. It's possible that the Pfizer vaccine might induce a greater immune response after one dose. We don't know that. It's possible, based on number of severe cases, that Moderna prevents more severe disease, but that's, those are pure speculation, right? Pure speculation based on the data that have been presented to the FDA so far. And I want to reiterate the point that both of these vaccines are very efficacious, very safe, and all of us should take whichever one is offered to us first. In terms of contraindications, Jose wanted me to cover contraindications, and I think probably a better way to talk about it is sort of unknowns. There are not really a ton of contraindications to any vaccine at this point per se, in that immunocompromised people, in theory, should probably all get vaccinated. However, they haven't really been studied yet, right? Children, if I could give the vaccine to my kids tomorrow, I would, absolutely. But there haven't been enough children in the trial yet to sort of have that level of evidence available to the FDA. So duration of vaccine effectiveness is unknown. Vaccine effectiveness against asymptomatic carriers is unknown. I think that's one important thing to talk about. Both the Pfizer trial and we believe the Moderna trial looked at defining a case as a case with symptoms plus a positive test. So it wasn't just a positive test. So one thing we don't know is the vaccine as efficacious against asymptomatic carriers as it is against people with symptoms. And so there's no science to think that it should be otherwise. But it is possible that if, for example, the vaccine was less efficacious in asymptomatic carriers, then that would have an effect on transmission. That said, the fact that cases occurred at a much lower rate in the vaccine group shows that transmission is likely impacted. So I guess in summary, the technology surrounding teaching our body to make antibodies against these proteins has really been around for years. I've got friends in my neighborhood. A guy runs a lab over at Duke on neurodegenerative diseases and trying to develop drugs for things like Alzheimer's and such. They've worked with mRNA technology and tried to make it work for their drugs. This is not something new. This is part of the reason why we were able to get it developed so fast for this particular purpose. We were able to get it developed so fast because of Operation Warp Speed, because of the public-private partnership, because of the laser focus of the FDA and drug makers on getting this done to get ourselves out of this pandemic. The EUA process is a rigid, reliable, appropriate process, even though it is quick. It has been around for a while. The vaccine safety and efficacy profiles, certainly for Pfizer and probably for Moderna and the others, are very reassuring. I think the last thing to say is this isn't over yet, right? So they're going to be looking at these vaccines for a long time and try to make them as perfect as possible. And we'll obviously be paying attention to that and reporting on those data as well.